Hi there, don't know if you can hear us. Hi Aida, this is Yanis.
Hi, I can hear you.
Awesome, and I can see you. It's a bit of a weird setup because I'm looking at the camera and I have to see you over there. We are in a very big room, but anyways, so give us kind of like a few more moments while everybody's kind of like coming in and they're sitting, and
Sure.
then I'll do an extremely quick introduction and then you will have the floor. Just give us a couple of seconds. Guys, have a
Sounds
seat,
good.
please. Thank you. Okay. Right, amazing. Sorry. For the audience, I have to be speaking while have my back to you. That's actually rule number one. You shouldn't be doing a theater, I know, but bear with me. So, so yeah. So, hi, Aida. We're very kind of like glad to have you here. Um, uh, what we have been doing in the past is like we're not doing any real introductions. So I'm not going to say that we're really glad to have you here, and you can start whenever you want. And the only other thing that I want to say is by the end, when we're going to have like the question session, bear with us because the only way you can hear is while we pass the microphone on. So, yeah, okay. So, without further ado, I'm really glad, guys, we have Aida Nematzadeh from Google DeepMind to talk about some cognitive science stuff. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thanks so much. So without, I guess, any delay, I'm going to jump in. I'm very excited to be giving this talk today. Thanks for having me. And I decided that I'm going to talk about leveraging cognitive science to evaluate the current generative models, or as the fancier title of the talk says, to unravel the complexities of generative models. And I'm sure that most of us have been very impressed with the new family of generative models and how realistic their outputs are. And most of us have either exposed to these outputs through social media or actually have played with them. Here, I just wanted to highlight two examples to show a text model and a generative image model, and on a topic that is related to the summer school, but also it's a more of a creative use case. So the first thing that I've done is I asked Gemini to write a poem about NLP conferences. And I'm not going to read the full poem, but as you are seeing on the slide here, the poem actually is consistent. It makes sense. It's a poem that probably is not common in the literature, so we don't expect to see a lot of poems around NLP conferences, but we get a few related topics. There's this line, it says, Neuroscience and deep learning's art push languages boundaries apart, which is kind of cute, but it's still like, using the coherent and right phrases and keywords in the poem. I also played with an image generation model here. In this case, it's the ideogram model. And when I prompted for a similar basically prompts, asking it to generate an image of an NLP conference, the image again is very impressive. It has the right components. It seems like, of a poster session of a conference where people are talking. There's some posters and, banners in the background. But this is actually, despite being a very simple sentence, it's a more complex prompt for an image generation model because of a few things. It involves a lot of people, and generating faces and hands and peoples are in general still challenging for for this family of models. And also it requires text rendering. And interestingly, in this image, the model has been able to generate the smaller text correctly, so the advanced NLP is generated correctly. Techniques has one error, but then the rest of the text on this poster is gibberish, but then NLP is generated correctly. So overall, it's not too bad. And again, given that it's an illustration of something that we don't have a lot of illustrations in the training data of. So if you think about these models, the way that we interact with them, most of us interact with them recently, is through prompting them and looking at their output. But the pipeline that has been going through the training of these models is actually quite complex. We have at the beginning of this pipeline the data curation, selection, and optimizing for the best data mixture part. And the input to these models are a combination of text, images, videos, and sometimes other modalities. Then there's this complex modeling pipeline that is happening with scaling models and also thinking about what happens after the model is pre-trained. So like we do a lot more after pre-training to tune these models for our use cases. And this whole pipeline is a black box, again, to most of us, which means that we don't know what the details of the data or the modeling components of this full pipeline are. Interestingly, we can make a similar analogy to this complex pipeline to how humans learn and how we actually are exposed to human learning. So if you think about children as they are like processing various types of input modalities from language to communication with other people or like social cues or interaction with real world objects, we don't necessarily have a full, we don't even have a full statistics of what they are exposed to in a day. They can be processing multiple types of input. We don't have the details of that data. At the same time, we don't really know what are the exact learning mechanisms or the models that a child forms as it's or she or he is processing this data. Interestingly, we have again access to the observed output or behavior of a child. It can be, drawings or writings or just the behavior that we observe. And this is something that cognitive scientists have been exposed to as they study humans for a very long time. So they study humans not necessarily accessing the black box or knowing the details of this black box, but by designing tasks that help them examine the observed behavior. And through these tasks and these studies, they can make conclusions about the model and the data, or better understand what are the causes of the behavior that we observe. So given this intro, today I want to talk about a few lines of work, and I want to focus on how I've been inspired by lessons from cognitive science, specifically through this lens. And I want to focus on two topics. The first one is collecting human data, which I think is very important given that human data is still our ground truth when it comes to evaluation of generative models. And secondly, I want to focus on how we can control the studies to to study specific capabilities or phenomena. And to me, this is interesting because we are at a time that these models are general models. They are generally good, but we want to identify specific things that they're really good at or specific things that they fail at to be able to actually either improve them or leverage the capabilities that they have. So thinking about controlled studies or probing methods is actually an important problem. So for the first part of the talk, focusing on human data, I want to focus on image generation models. And if you think about image generation models and how we evaluate them, there are a few things that we need to consider. So the first thing that goes into these models and first part of our evaluation pipeline is a prompt set. So we start with designing this prompt set, and the content of this prompt set actually changes the output of the evaluation. So we need to think carefully, how are we going to choose this prompt set? What are the sentences that we're going to generate images for? And then we usually have a few models, or maybe sometimes one iterations of one specific models, and we want to pick the best model. And we do that by generating images given the sets of prompts, and then looking at ways to evaluate the output, which is either collecting human data or using automatic metrics. And then for these metrics, we often also need to think, what are the right metrics? How can we develop better metrics? And can they replace human evaluation? So the first part of the talk, I want to focus on one specific capability that we really care about, specifically for the recent models. They are really good at generating high quality, realistic, also hyper-realistic images. But what we really want to improve is whether they are following the prompt, whether all the aspects of the text that is in the prompt is actually generated in the image. And I will refer to this as alignment. So the definition of alignment here is really the correspondence between the sentence and the images. So given this pipeline, assume that we have now a few models with generated images and we want to evaluate them through collecting human data. There are a few templates, human templates that we can choose, and previous work has used various like basically different templates to evaluate human data. But if you look at the overall design of these templates, we can divide them to 4 main ones. The first 3 are what we refer to as absolute comparison, which means that we have an image and a prompt, one data point, and we want to get a rating for these specific image and prompt with respect to alignment. A very common one that is used in the literature is Likert, where you ask annotators to give a score between 1 to 5, for example. It can be any numerical scale, where 5 is more alignment, 1 is less alignment. Another template that we looked at is what we refer to as a finer grained template, because we ask annotators to actually think about how each word in the sentence is captured in the image and give a rating for each word. So it's a more expensive template, but it gives us a bit more information and actually forces annotators to go over all the words and consider them. And then finally, we looked at another template, which is referred to as DSG in the literature. It's based on its previous work where they generate question and answers automatically, and they take these questions and see if annotators can answer the questions correctly for a given image. And then we also can look at what we call a relative comparison templates. Here, instead of looking at one prompt and one image, we look at one prompt, but more than one image, for example, 2 images from 2 different models. And here we ask the annotators, what is the best image for this given prompt? And we can basically give them further instructions of what they should be looking at when they are making this comparison. We refer to this template as side-by-side because we're showing the images side-by-side and asking the annotators to pick. So given this many ways to collect human data, it was interesting that there is really no standardized way to collect human data, even for measuring alignment, if we look at the image generation literature. And one question is, does the result change as we look at various templates? And do we really need to actually come up with one template, or do we need to use more than one template when we make judgments about the models? And I think previous work basically looks at various templates, or each work basically picks one template because none of these templates are perfect. There's challenges that you can identify for each of them. For example, if you think about the first template, the Likert template, it doesn't give us a very detailed response. We get a score. We don't necessarily know why an annotator chose that response, and sometimes it might not be because there is something wrong in the image. So in this example, we have a giraffe stands in the field. Some raters pick this as fully consistent, so the score is 5, but we also have a score of 4. But we really don't know why. Like, it might be that the annotators saw something, or it might be that the annotator made a mistake. If we think about the DSG one, where we generate the question and answer pairs automatically, it's not great because sometimes this automatic generation pipeline misses some questions. So in the example of the owl, there is no question relating to the owl or the wood carving. So we don't get something as, is there an owl in the image? And the annotators basically just ignore that part of the prompt because of that. And then in the word level case, where we actually ask rate all the words, we might have words in the prompt that are less groundable. We don't necessarily, or we cannot really, show them in the image. And that might be confusing for the annotators in terms of how they're going to rate those words. So given these templates and the ways that we can collect data, what we wanted to get a sense was how much we can increase the quality of the data if we look at various templates, and does the quality of the data that we collect from annotators changes depending on the templates. So what we've done is that we took 4 generative models, Imagen, Muse, and a stable diffusion X large, and a stable diffusion 1.5, and then we collected annotations through 4 templates that I just told you about across a large set of prompts. So after doing that, when we look at the inter-annotator agreement across each model template pair, and what we observe here, which I'm showing you in the table, is that for most of these cases, agreement is actually above chance. So there's high agreement, and not only it's above chance, there's also high agreement for most generative models. So here, the maximum agreement that we can get is 1. And as you can see, there's for most of the pairs, the agreement is above 0.68. Which is good. So that's good news. The data is overall high quality. There's one pair which has lower inter-annotator agreement, and that's when we look at a stable diffusion 1.5, and we collect data with the Likert template. And we think that the reason that this is happening is because the images from a stable diffusion 1.5, which is an earlier model, are lower quality, which means that basically the annotations that we get are also less reliable, because if the image is just not really good, the raters cannot make accurate judgments about the alignment. Another interesting observation here was that when we look at word level and DSG, the inter-annotator agreement is higher. So this tells us that if we look at the finer grained templates, where we are actually forcing the annotators to look at the specific words, not the full sentence, to make a judgment, we get higher quality data. But so this is like, one evaluation of the template. It tells us how good each template is, and we now have a sense of how high quality our data is. But what we really want to use this human data in practice is for model comparison. So we want to be able to make a judgment, and also a reliable judgment, about the two models. And these days, these models can be very similar. So that making like, subtle changes, basically identifying subtle changes in the output is what we really go for. Not necessarily like, a model that is generating very low quality images compared to a model that is generating very high quality images. And we realized that in previous work, again, what people have been using for evaluation of models given this data is just looking at the average score across templates. So for a given model and one template, previous work will average the score and then take this score and compare it with the average score that they would get for one template for a new model. And we realized that this is actually not necessarily giving us the right direction of the comparison or like a right evaluation, mainly because the difference between the models might not even be statistically significant. So we defined a new task for evaluating the generative models given human data, which is first measuring the significance of difference between the given the scores of the two models. And if there is a difference, then we are going to determine the direction of the relation by looking at the average score. And in this figure, I'm showing you these relations basically for all the image pairs across 3 prompt sets, so synthetic, real, and all are our prompt sets. And then I'm also looking at 3 templates where we collect human data. So WL is the word level, the fine grained one, L is the Likert, and the H is the SGH, where we ask questions. So this gives you a full picture of like how the conclusions that we can make, depending on which slice of this data we had looked at, can be different. And again, the reason that we did this, looking at all these different templates and different models, was to be able to see how reliable the judgments that we make if we do not pick the same template across work can be. And also think about which template is the template to pick in future evaluations. So interestingly, when we looked at the synthetic prompts, so this is a data set where the prompts are generated using a language model. So we have some templates, we generate prompts using a language model. They are less real world in that sense. That's why we call them synthetic. Interestingly, if you look at this prompt set, which is maybe the easier prompt set, all the templates agree in their judgment. So, if you look at these 3, they're all the same. And similarly, across all model pairs, we see similar judgment, which is good. But things become a bit more complicated when we look at our real world prompt sets. So here we see different colors, which means that there are templates that do not agree with each other. And in most cases, we have 2 templates that they agree. Actually, in all cases, we have 2 templates that they agree. But what we observe overall is that the fine-grained templates always agree, and they may disagree with Likert, which again tells us that these fine-grained templates are more reliable for making judgment on this realistic data set. And then finally, what we did was we looked at the full set, because in a real-world setting, again, we want to have a larger, more diverse and comprehensive prompt set to make sure that we make the correct judgment about the model pair. And if we combine these prompt sets and look at the full set, again, there's discrepancies between the judgments that we get depending on the template. But the good news is that if we look at the fine-grained templates, they always agree. So we can basically pick word level, and then that would give us a reliable judgment with this statistical significant test for a model pair. It also tells us that Likert is probably the template that we don't want to use if we want to basically make a reliable comparison between the models. So having talked about the human data, I want to also now focus on developing automatic metrics. And the reason that we are interested in this is that collecting human data can be expensive and slow. And when we do develop models, we want to have reliable metrics that we can hill climb over without having to evaluate human data for each checkpoint, basically. And in recent years, we have the opportunity to actually have very strong foundational models, which basically tell us or suggest that we might be able to use them as a proxy of are humans and collect human data. Instead of collecting human data, just use these models. So this work that we did, and it's also actually has been done in many other similar types of papers now externally, was inspired by this idea that we can use generative models as a proxy for human data. And the pipeline that we have is very simple. We start by a generated image and a text prompt. And then inspired by the summarization literature, we generate question answering pairs for the prompt, which gives us a list of question answer pairs. And then we use a VQA model. For example, both these two can be generative models like the ones that I showed you at the beginning of the talk to get a sense of how good the model is. So the ground truth here for us is the answers that the QA module generates, and then we're going to compare the answers that the VQA model generates for a given question and an image with the ground truth one, which is basically from, again, this QA module. And then, as I mentioned here, we're taking these two models as a proxy of humans to get a metric that hopefully will be able to replace human data. Given this automatic evaluation pipeline, now we need to actually evaluate our metric and say how reliably it can replace human data. So what we did is, again, take this metric and validate it across many conditions. And we only say the metric is good if it actually shows a good performance across many prompt sets and many tasks. And for the sake of time, I'm going to just show you one type of evaluation that we did, which is this instance-based evaluation, where we want to see whether the score that the metric generates for an image and a text is very similar to the score that humans generate for that image and the text. And then we can take our 4 templates, 4 human templates that I talked about, the word level, the Likert, the DSG, and side by side to see if the metric is actually good at replicating each of these the results in each of these settings. And then we compare the 3 recent QA-based methods, which are TIFA, DSG, and the one that we developed called Gecko, with a clip baseline, where we get a score by just passing an image and a text to a clip model without getting this fine-grained QA pairs and comparing for each answer of the question answer pair given a VQA model. So what we see, the first set of results that we see is that over all the conditions that we look at, these QA-based approaches actually outperform clip by a high margin. So if you look at the blue bar here, which is the clip, is always lower than the other lines. We also see that our proposed method is better than the other QA-based metrics. And again, for this, I'm not going to go to the details, but what we've done to get this improvement is thinking about where the pre-trained models, the generative models fail, and try to come up with solutions for improving those failure modes, for example, by removing hallucination. We also see that the QA approaches are, and especially our Gecko metric, are better in predicting human data if we compare them with this approach, which is called VNLI, and it's a supervised method in ways that they're actually taking a pre-trained model, it's not zero-shot, but fine-tuning it for this specific task, which is also a good news, because in a zero-shot setting, if our basically backend model improves, we can just replace it and get better results. We don't have to repeat the fine-tuning process to get the metric working. And then finally, given that we have this prompt set that gives us fine-grained categories, we can also see where the metrics fail the most and where they are mostly, like what is their strengths and what is their weaknesses. So here I'm showing the results for Gecko, DSG, and VNLI across categories. Here, color basically means that that prompt is mainly testing for color, or count, for example, is the prompts that are mainly testing for counting. And what we see here is that for all the QA-based metrics, the style, text, and name entity are really hard. And this is actually not surprising, given that the backbone generative models that we use are not necessarily as strong in measuring text rendering or name entity or a style. So to summarize this part, basically, I wanted to emphasize on how we need to evaluate how we collect human data before actually using this human data to make judgments or conclusions about models. And what we've observed is that when it comes to measuring alignment, the fine-grained templates results in higher quality data if we measure it in terms of inter-annotator agreement, and also they provide a more consistent model ordering, so we can be, a bit more confident about the judgments that we make about which model is better than the other ones. And then we see that these automatic evaluation metrics, the QA ones, can replace humans if we use a strong foundational model as a backbone. And specifically for many categories of prompts, we can easily replace human evaluation by these metrics and only collect human data maybe at the end of training, or maybe on the prompt sets that require skill sets that are still hard for these generative models. So for the next part of the talk, I want to focus on how we can actually study a specific phenomena by thinking about designing the experiments or control the studies for that specific phenomena. And what I want to do is focus on numerical reasoning, again, in the context of evaluation of multimodal generative models. So back to our pipeline, I mentioned that we start with a prompt set. And if you want to focus on numerical reasoning and basically evaluate numerical reasoning, what we need to do is to design a prompt set that measures numerical reasoning in a controlled way. So thinking about the prompt that I have on this slide, it says cat with a pointer standing in front of blackboard. It actually measures a few things. And we can look at our QA responses to see which ones are answered incorrectly and make a judgment about the model capability in answering that specific question. But it's not going to be a general way to measure a specific thing, such as numerical reasoning, because we don't have enough variations in the prompt with the number or with different types of numerical reasoning. So what we did is designing this benchmark and specifically thinking about 3 tasks to measure. And this work was inspired to some extent by the work that cognitive psychologists do when they evaluate the capability of numerical reasoning in children and animals. Overall, we have 3 tasks. The first task is measuring exact quantities. So here we are interested in asking the model to generate a number of objects, and we just really want to see that exact number of objects generated in the image. We also look at a task which focuses on approximate quantities. Here, what we want is quantities such as a few or many, which are not exact in that there's no specific count, but linguistically we have sense associated to these words, and we want to see if we can generate the same concept in the images. Finally, we look at a task that we refer to as complex reasoning, and here we look at the generation of, for example, parts. Like we want to be able to generate one slice of a cake, and a bit more complicated numerical concepts, which I will talk about a bit more in details. So given this pipeline, what we need is first thinking about how we will design these prompts for each specific task. And then we will generate images, again, for a range of models to make sure that the conclusions that we make are not model dependent. So we looked at more than 7 models. And then we finally need to collect human data to measure the strengths of the models given this prompt set. And we can use this final annotation to both evaluate the models and also evaluate our automatic metrics, which I'm not going to talk about today, but happy to answer questions offline. You can also read on it in the paper. A bit more details about the prompt set. So here I'm showing some examples of all the tasks. The first task is basically divided to sub-skills based on what we wanted to control over. First thing is just really having simple numeric sentences where we're just asking for a number and an object, and we vary the object by basically thinking about the frequency of the word and how common that a word can be, and then trying to cover a full range of this, basically the full distribution of the frequency. And then we look at additive prompts where we have something and something, and then the 2 things that the 2 phrases that we are looking at can have different numbers. For example, we can have 4 coconuts, and 5 cats. So, which is a bit more difficult because it's not just generating the concept of number once, but also knowing that which word is bounded to what number and generating the two correctly. We also look at the effect of attributes such as color in the phrases. So we'll add attributes such as green, 2 green apples, and we vary these attributes. Another complexity that is also hard for these models is the spatial relations. So we also control for that by having a specific prompt set where we look at number and spatial relations in one sentence. So we can have something like there are 2 mushrooms above 3 tables. And then we also look at sentences that are similar to simple numeric, but just full sentences, so a bit more complex sentence structure, still very simple though. And then in the second task, we look at approximate quantifiers. Here we vary the objects and the word that is measuring this type of approximate concept. So it can be, again, few, many, and also no. So we can have an image of a vase. There are no flowers in the vase. And then finally, in task 3, we are going to look at fractions. So here we can have, something that has 3 slices, a pizza cut into 3 slices. We can also have a bit more complex fractional sentences, such as an image of a pencil where one half is red and the other half is blue. We also look at part-whole relations, which we know are interestingly harder for human children to learn as a concept. So as an example here, we can have, there are 2 forks on the table, but 1 fork is broken into 2 pieces. Overall, we have basically different number of prompts in each category, but we try to cover as many variations of the specific sub-skill by varying the number and other attributes in the sub-skill. So let's look at the results of model evaluation given this prompt set. The first thing that we observed here is that our best model, back when we first did this evaluation, was DALL-E 3. And interestingly, it was doing much better than the baseline, which is 10 in the first task and 24 in the second task. Still a gap between the best model and the maximum achievable performance, which is 100. But if we looked at the third task, all models, including DALL-E, is performing very close to the random chance baseline, which is 50% in this case. And this tells us that this task of conceptual quantitative reasoning is really hard for the image generation model. And then also we see that the second task, not surprisingly, is harder than the first task. Another interesting, result that is worth noting is if you look at one model family, for example, Imagen or Muse, it's not always the case that the most recent version of a model is the strongest. For example, with Imagen, we see that Imagen C is actually better in task 1 than Imagen D, which is a more recent model. It tells us that some of the things that have been gone through the modeling pipeline is probably reducing the performance on the numerical task while improving other things, potentially image quality and maybe alignment. We also looked at, after this was done in the first iteration of the paper, we looked at a recent model that was released, which is Imagen 3. And then interestingly, we see improved performance for task 1, even this more recent model compared to DALL-E. So we see around 12% improved performance. But still, there is a notable gap between Imagen. So if you consider 58 compared to 100, which is the maximum achievable performance, even for this simple task 1, there is a notable gap between our best model and what we can achieve. I also want to just show you some qualitative examples, mainly because I think it shows where and how these models fail. And it also shows how some of the prompts that we think are very simple can be very difficult for these models. In particular, if you look at task 1, which again is just testing for generation of numbers, also small numbers up to 10 in various conditions, there are many red crosses here, which are cases where the image is generated incorrectly. And one particular example that I find very interesting is the example of 7 statues. For many objects, the model can generate the number of 7 easily, but statues are hard. Not, I don't think because they are uncommon in pre-training data, but because I think we don't talk about small quantities of this type of object. Usually, you get a bunch of pistachios, but you don't get a specific number. Like, you're not requesting an exact number when we talk when we think about pistachios. Also similarly for olives. So all of the models fail for this specific example. And then when we think about more complex prompts, such as there are 3 paper clips to the left of one leaf, we see that Dolly is actually generating this correctly. So this one has both counting and spatial relation reasoning in the prompt, but the 2 other models, Imogen and Muse, are failing. So to sum up this part, when we think about controlled study of a specific phenomena, and in this case, we focused on numerical reasoning and counting because it poses a challenge to recent, not just generative model, but also our image text encoders. What we did here is basically thinking about different ways that we need to control a prompt to only measure about numerical reasoning, and also make sure that we can make conclusions that not only test one specific type of reasoning, but a wide range of reasoning. And what we observe is that this is still very challenging for image generation models, and we only see good performance for our simplest task. I know I have only 10 minutes left, but I want to quickly talk about another example of this type of controlled study, because I think it highlights a different way that we can come up with probing benchmarks and how we can use it to evaluate models. So in this work, we focused on representations of verbs. And the reason that we were interested in verbs was that most existing work, when we think about the evaluation of image text models and also image video models, is focusing really on nouns. And concrete nouns are interesting, but they are very consistent across images. So if I show you an image of an apple, or if I show you basically a few images of apples and I just randomly pick them from a large data set, you can see apples, very clearly in all these images, and they look very similar. So we can easily see them. But if you think about verbs, they are way more complex because they're not just measuring one thing, they are measuring the relation between 2 or 3 things. So here, all the images are images of eating, but they are very different in terms of what's being eaten, who is doing the action of the eating, and also just visually very different in terms of the texture, colors, and this makes it very hard for the models to learn them and also to evaluate them. And interestingly, if you think about how we have been modeling objects or nouns, it's through a classification task. So that's really simple. We can just collect very small number of data points, train a model, and then get good performance. But if you think about verbs, it's more of a structured prediction task, which is a more complex modeling task and also requires different type of data to be collected. So what do people do when they think about evaluation of image generation model? Our typical task is an image retrieval task, or which can be either text-to-image retrieval or image-to-text retrieval. But in both cases, basically, we are comparing the similarity of the text to an image. In terms of, if you think about the image retrieval setting, and we here focus on the zero-shot case because we want to just evaluate the representations without confounding, without other confounding factors that comes to the play when we look at the fine-tuning setup. We will have a sentence such as gray-haired man in black and yellow tie, and then we have a predefined sets of images, and we want to find the right image for that sentence. And this is not great because the models can just pick up very small things in the sentence to find the right image in our limited set that we use as our retrieval set. So to give you an example, imagine that I have only 3 images, and I'll ask a model to find the one that is related to this person is riding a horse. And this, in this case, the model can order the images very correctly by only focusing on the word horse, right? It doesn't really need to understand the verb or other parts of the sentence. What we wanted to do was basically coming up with a task which is a bit more fine-grained and be able to probe for understanding of the verbs, not just verbs, but also subjects and objects, but focusing on verbs. And we're going to basically take each sentence and divide it to a verb, a subject, and an object, and design a task that gives us this ability for a controlled evaluation. So we collected this data set, which we refer to as subject, verb, object probes. And in this basically, given the data that we had, we define the task to be a classification task, but in where we have to basically match the right sentence, not only to the correct image, but also say that the wrong image doesn't match the sentence. So we need to classify both positive and negative examples correctly. And the way that we collected the images are ensuring that there's only one part of the sentence, either the subject or the verb or the object, that are different in these images. So as you can see, both of these images have a horse and a person, but they differ in the verb. One of them is a riding image, and the other one is a person standing by the horse. And if you're interested, you can basically take this data and use it for evaluation of recent models. When we did this work, we were focusing on only encoders, and we were focusing on multimodal transformers, which again, I'm not gonna get into the details, but the models are trained using different types of losses, but all of them have an image language matching loss, which means that we can take them and evaluate them in a zero-shot setting in a retrieval task. To look at our results, what we did is basically taking our models and then looking at their performance for both verbs and subjects, and also objects that are more closer to our concrete nouns that initially I talked about. In the case of verb, we will have examples such as a woman lying with a dog, and then we'll have two images. There will be dog and a woman in both images, but the verbs are different. So one of them is the woman lying, and then the other one will be the woman running. And what we see here is that the model is performing only 10% above chance. So it shows that the verb understanding is really hard for these models. And then if you look at subjects, the performance improves, but still it's less than 70% and much below the 100% that the model can achieve. And the images here are again only different with respect to the subject. So we can have an example such as an animal lays in the grass, and then both images will have lay and grass in them, which are the verbs and the object, but they will differ in the subject. So one of them has an animal, one of them has a person. And then finally, we do the same thing for objects. Here, the example can be a woman jogs on the beach, and then we'll see that the woman and the jogging are repeated in both images, but the object, which is the beach, can be basically different. So one of them is in a jungle, the other one is on the beach. And interestingly, the performance on the object is still not close to 100%, but as expected, it's much higher than the verbs, and it's the best performance. So overall, if we average all these categories, we see that the performance is around 64, which means that there's a lot of room for improvement for these models. And again, these models, like the models that we evaluated, are now many years old, but we can take this benchmark and evaluate more recent models using the same task. We also did some other experiments where we controlled for the type of pre-training data. And here the question was, what type of pre-training data helps the same family of models perform well on verb understanding? So we looked at MS-COCO and conceptual captions that are very different. MS-COCO is a very small data set these days. It's only 100K images, while conceptual caption, which had 3 million images back then, was considered a very large data set. But MS-COCO is very clean in terms of how much the images correspond to the sentence, because it's actually manually annotated. So we expect that most parts of the sentence are in the image because people wrote that sentence for the image. Conceptual captions, on the other hand, is very noisy because it's curated from the web, and there's no guarantee that the text matches the image, and there can be parts of the text that are actually not seen in the image. And then finally, the way we collected this data, it was in terms of domain, it matches conceptual captions, because we wanted to test models that were all using conceptual captions in their pre-training. So there is a domain mismatch with this data and MS COCO, but it's closer with conceptual captions. So we pre-trained models on these two data sets, conceptual captions and COCO, and when we evaluate them on two tasks. One of them is the sphere probes that I told you, and then the other one is this task called FOIL, which is a previous work that basically does something very similar but focuses on non-understanding. And what I want to highlight here is that, interestingly, if you look at the performance on the model that is trained on COCO, the smaller data set, it's doing better on FOIL and also SVO probes. And we think that this happens because the COCO data is just less noisy, which means that the model is actually able to learn better about the relation between an object and also a verb and parts of the image. And also shows that these models are not really robust to noise, so we need to think of ways to clean our data before pre-training them on large data sets. And then one final result that I want to show, which is related, we basically looked at this capability of understanding verbs. In this case, we call it actions on the image generation models. And interestingly, it's still one of the hardest skills for image generation models. So if you look at something like colors, it's very easy comparably to actions. And then it is basically even harder than numerical reasoning for some models, which I found quite interesting. All right, I'm almost out of time, so I just want to summarize and say a few final things. So one thing that I hope you take away from this talk is that we still need human data as our gold standard to make conclusions about generative models. But we usually don't spend a lot of time thinking about how we should collect that human data such that the judgments that we make are reliable. And there's also not a lot of standardization across different work for using the same type of templates when we compare models. So it's important to think about this if we want to compare models and also compare work that have their own evaluation pipeline. And then finally, given that we have very powerful generative models, I think it's really important to think about these probing tasks because the models are general, right? We have models that can generate things, either images, videos, or language that are generally good. But what we are, that basically what this leaves us is being able to identify what are their core strengths, so where they are very reliable and we can use them to replace, let's say, humans, and where they are more limited, which basically gives us an opportunity to think about modeling work. And I think to be able to do that, we actually need to come up with specific evaluation paradigms for each capability, and we cannot just rely on benchmarks that measure many things. With that, I want to thank you for listening, and also all my collaborators and folks who are highlighted on the slide are the ones who led most of the work, and I can take questions.
Everybody hear me? Thank you so much for this amazing talk. Let me see if there are any questions. Questions, anyone? Yes, there's something over there.
Thank you for the talk. I was wondering about if multiple annotation or disagreement about disagreement in human annotators is also taken into account like within the training strategy, because like if we somehow are able to also inform the model about the difficulty of the examples it is being trained on, maybe it could be useful for the learning.
Yeah, I think
what's
that's
your take? Yeah, sorry. I mean, what's your take on that? Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting idea. So in this line of work, I haven't really focused on improving or modeling aspects of the pipeline, and was mostly focusing on evaluation. But you're right, given the data that we have, we can model a few things. We can model the uncertainty of the response because we know for certain types of prompts, annotators are more uncertain. You can also just use this to improve models with respect to alignment, because now we have examples of high alignment data points. So we can do like different types of modeling with either reward modeling or just supervised fine-tuning given this data. What we did actually, which I didn't talk about today, given the data that we had, was focusing on coming up with a prompt set, which we can call reliable prompt set. Because when we look at different prompts and images where people disagree, sometimes it's not because of the template, but it's because the prompt is actually a bit more complex. So humans are not able to make a judgment because the prompt is asking for something that can be subjective. So if you ask, an old building, what is considered old is very subjective, also relative to the time that you're thinking. Is it 100-year-old? Is it like 50-year-old? Or is it 1,000-year-old? And then similarly, if you ask for style or sometimes cultural specific terms, annotators might just not know, and then that's why they're not really making reliable judgments. So what we did was looking at all the prompts that had higher inter-annotator agreement across model template pairs, and then looking at that subset as our evaluation benchmark. And if we do that, basically we ensure that these prompts are mostly testing for alignment, and we can rely on the judgments of annotators a bit more because it actually gives us higher inter-annotator agreement. So it's not only useful for evaluation, but you can, as you mentioned, also use them for improving models.
Okay, thank you very much for that. Any more questions from the floor? No? Everybody's too tired for the full day. Yeah, probably will be exhausted. Okay, well, I guess we can just thank the speaker again once more. Thank you so much, Aida, for that.
No worries.
And have a lovely rest of your day. Thanks so much.
Thank you. Bye.